first keynote session focuses on value-based leaderships in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Our speaker, Professor Dr. Mehmet Asute, is Director of Durham Center for Islamic Economics and Finance of Durham University. He obtained his PhD in political economics from the University of Leicester, United Kingdom. He is also the managing editor of the Review of Islamic Economics and is an associate editor of the American Journal of Islamic Social Science and in the editorial board of International Journal of Islamic and Middle Eastern Finance and Management and Borsa Istanbul Review. To advocate the merits of value-based leadership for good governance and to challenge us to reflect on our leadership practices, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Professor Dr. Mehmet Asute.
Assalamu alaikum, and good morning to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's good to be here in Kuala Lumpur. I used to visit frequently Kuala Lumpur, but in the last few years I have not been able to, and therefore it is good to be back. In particular, it is good to be back with such an audience. I'm really delighted. I'm delighted to be here, to be part of this particular event. And thank you as well for the illuminating opening remarks, particularly referring to that value system that we refer, how we can embed such value system through the education system so that the outcomes that we expect to fit into our expectations. The value system, of course, is a terribly difficult topical area. In particular, with the emergence of the postmodernist understanding, how the values have become important. While it is important and in everyday practices, we hear from everyone on the importance of values, but at the same time, it's a terribly complicated topical area. Because as the title of the speech here refers to the unity, but at the same time, of course, value is difficult to bring together just one value. Because somehow, although modernity told us that the value is only one reality, but since 1970s, with the emergence of multidisciplinary approach to social sciences, we come to learn that values can be different, socially constructed. Each one of them, each one of us, have particular tastes, particular ways of looking at reality, because each one of us has different vision, different ways of looking at the reality. Some of us like green, some of us like yellow, some of us like black. And each one of those has implications the way we look at reality as well. And therefore, perhaps, rather than using the catchword, establishing unity through diversity, but I think that aspect of diversity in terms of what values are, important aspect of looking at reality. Because on the one hand, with the emergence of modernity, and the way modernity was imposed in the rest of the world from beyond the Eurocentric world, we were told that there is one way of looking at reality. And we were taught in our schools as well, in developing countries, including Malaysia, that our curricula is very much reflective of that Eurocentric understanding. However, then later, looking at the reality, well, perhaps it's not necessarily the case, and therefore the entire debate started on the value. And in particular, of course, when it comes to economics, finance, management, governance-related areas, in recent years, the failures has reflected on, look, there are things are wrong in the system, and therefore this value-free or unitary understanding of value perhaps is not the solution. Therefore, how we can move away and develop this perhaps a diverse understanding of values are, and whether can we create our curriculums, our policies related to social, economic, policies, looking at the theories, institutions, and processes, whether the value can come back. And through that, so that we can understand beyond that surface. In other words, rather than providing a shallow understanding what the reality is, perspective, the title of the presentation is very challenging. There are quite number of looking at now quite number of concepts in the title. Okay, you are talking about value-based leadership, value on the one hand, the leadership in addition, but then we are talking about the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. Now, it's very complicated from the title as well. In other words, the title suggests that reality is very difficult. But the problem, of course, over the centuries with the Enlightenment period, we were told that modernity will overcome and will establish a unity and everything will be overcome. Even, I come from economics background, and those of you who have done economics as well, you would know the first thing we would teach students in the class, the neoclassical understanding of what perfect market is. The perfect market, okay? Because modernity told us that that's the only way. Okay, that's the only way that he can have an economic understanding, a financial system. Those of you familiar, again, you might remember in 1990s, Fukuyama wrote that famous book, The End of History, which suggested that there isn't any other way of organizing economy and society. There's only one way, that's the market economy. So therefore, it comes with a package, a particular value system. Okay, what is that value system? Of course, the modernity-based value system. And what we do in our teaching economics, we start a perfect market economy because that is the starting point. Modernity promised a world without problems, perfect market economy. But after the first few lectures, until the students graduate, we tell them the failures. The entire economics teaching is related with failures, okay? Again, those of you familiar with econometrics, okay, the entire story of econometrics is not what you can explain. The entire story, these are very much the indication. Unfortunately, initially, we have been giving this perfect world. Modernity told us the world that they are going to create, the end of history, that's the perfect world. However, in reality, when we look at the entire curriculums that we are developing and using, is based on the failure part, okay, rather than the perfect. In other words, the whole creation of this imaginary perfection that modernity was trying to develop wasn't a reality. It was just the imagination. And therefore, it didn't help us to develop the necessary structures and necessary knowledge to be able to deal with what we are facing, and therefore the accumulation of problems that we have in front of us. And that is because they tried to overcome all those different values in different parts of the world and relegating everything into one particular value system, the way they understand the society. In other words, by relegating the complexity to simple, they were thinking that that's an efficient solution, but that efficiency, of course, it doesn't work because you accumulate the problems. So efficiency that we have been taught, and since the beginning of 20th centuries, is not necessarily the best way of overcoming the problems or producing solutions, because you are generating more problems in the process. And therefore, in this session, although I come from economics background and I'm specialized in recent years in Islamic economics and finance, but my major curiosity in the way knowledge is created and how that knowledge creation reflects a particular value system. In other words, I'm very much interested in the social theory, as we call it. And that social theory does not only relate to social sciences, but how knowledge construction is developed, including in the physical or the natural sciences. And therefore, I try to take up from there and look into how this value-based understanding is something as a leadership that we can consider. And therefore, I thought perhaps the best thing is to look into these concepts that we are referring. What are those concepts? Because these are not innocent concepts. The concepts that we have around us, when we read a book, when we teach, we use a lot of concepts, a lot of jargons. But it is important that we need to deconstruct these concepts to understand the value that they are representing, okay? Because each statement that we make, each statement that we read has a particular implications, comes from a particular value construct, and relates to a particular value construct, in other words. And therefore, the deconstructivism as a philosophical understanding has been very much useful for us to understand the knowledge creation process, because we need to unpack whatever the knowledge there, rather than perceive the knowledge around us as value-free, neutral, it can apply to all of us. No, it doesn't work that way. Therefore, the deconstruction of knowledge is important so that we can look into how specific knowledge areas through the value-based understanding can be constructed, and that is important why it is our claim that the value-free knowledge that has been imposed on the world has not solved the problems. Okay? And therefore, our challenge have to bring back whatever we are doing, from medicine to social sciences, from economics to physics, how the values can be brought back and generate something. And by saying that, I'm not referring to Islamization of knowledge type of movements, because again, the deconstruction process doesn't work there, but going beyond that, so that we can see how concepts, theories, institutions, processes, and practices are constructed by deconstructing it, and we can see how the knowledge has been packaged, and then we would be able to see that in the behind, despite the fact that they told us that this is entirely value-free, it is not value-free. There is a value, and it conveys a particular value. Therefore, how we can look into that. And in doing that, therefore, it is important for us, the first thing, like everyone talks about values, as I mentioned. Those of you familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. Before that is the Millennium Development Goals, and etc. Each one of them suggests how to take the world forward. And each one of them, of course, has a particular value system. Now, each country in the world, including Malaysia, is party to Sustainable Development Goals. But yes, on the surface, it's amazing, and I do support as well. But on the other hand, it has a particular value system. Okay? It wants to convey a particular value system, and it is perhaps the end of history type of discourse, and therefore how important for us to understand what is lying behind. And therefore values, when we look at it, is the underlying, the foundation, the norms, okay? Norms and cognitive repertoire of a society. And therefore, although in everyday life, in every communication, we use the value, but when we attach to the definition of value, when we look at the definition, when we deconstruct it, it refers to norms and cognitive repertoire. In other words, we have something socially constructed, the way we approach things. Okay, in a particular way, each one of us approach in a particular way. And that is one, is the individual, how individual sees the world, and second and importantly, what is the cognitive repertoire? Okay, when we refer to cognitive repertoire in Malaysia, you are talking about the Malay, Chinese, and etc. Each one of them over the centuries in this society developed certain qualities, certain ways of looking at reality, from thinking power to artifacts. So you have all those different ways of expression, okay? So each one of us comes to the table with a particular normative understanding, our value system at the top, and how that is then brought to particular normative understanding, the norms. So in the end, therefore, our values converted into beliefs, and beliefs converted into or articulated through particular attitudes. In other words, our everyday attitudes, one way or another, regardless of whatever the particular philosophical, religious, sociological understanding we have, it is our attitudes are a reflection of those belief mechanisms. Regardless whether you are religious or atheist or whatever, each one of us has a particular way of understanding reality. And that reality, of course, shapes through our norms what we see around us. And therefore, when we look at values, it's very much is concealed below everyday social life, okay? But it is fundamental for the organizations to surface that phenomena, the way we understand the reality through that. But therefore, it is important to understand for us that values represent general moral principles. And each one of us get the source of that moral principle from a particular ontological base. Okay, some of us religious, some of us not, some of us believe X religion, Y religion, and etc. But each one of us understand the source of knowledge in a different way. But of course, you may immediately ask, yes, textbooks. Textbooks are packaging the information and giving the students, and it has a particular, again, value system. Regardless of what our own value system or the value system that we want to give the students is different, because all of us teaching like economics, sociology, whatever, we translate books, and therefore by translating them, bringing to the class, we are one way or another conveying those values. In other words, the cultural repertoire, the knowledge developed from a cultural repertoire, from a particular world, that's the Eurocentric understanding, we are bringing to the everydayness. And therefore, we need to understand what value is. In other words, it is not that innocent in terms of talking, when we talk about value-free nature of knowledge. No, there is no value-free knowledge. Okay? Beyond the ideologies, each one of us construct in a particular way. Beyond, again, even that understanding, cultural repertoire of each society perceives social reality in a particular way compared to the others. But what is important for us to understand, values help us to constitute the reality and the way we see reality in a particular way. And that's important for us. In other words, the culture, religion, whatever we call it, that determines what values are, and those values then translated into attitudes, and attitudes translated into everyday behavior. And in this, of course, when we talk about values, they are the general beliefs that we have, which define what is right, what is wrong. In other words, ontological meaning of knowledge. They tell us ontological meaning of knowledge. And then they are expressed into attitudes, and the attitudes are expressed through the values, and also causes a person to act or react in a particular way. And then it becomes behavior. In other words, the everyday actions that we have around us. And therefore, our behaviors, what we see in everyday practices, is very much reflections of that value system that we come from. However, over the years, of course, over the centuries even, we were told that the knowledge created is value-free. and therefore it applies to every part of the world. However, with the denial that knowledge came, because that knowledge is produced in a particular part of the world with the cognitive realities of that world. In other words, for instance, again, give an example from economics, market economy. Market economy represents a disembedded understanding, is value-free. That is the value of market economy, suggesting that it is value-free, and that's an amazing thing because it's not dependent on values. But it is a product of a particular society, particular cognitive reality. It came out from the tradition, the way of living of a particular society, European society. Therefore, it represents the cognitive reality of that society, and hence is not value-free. It's just the imposition of a particular value to the rest of the world. And therefore, when we look at this, the VUCA world, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, of course, these are important for us to consider in understanding the world in which we live. Of course, in reality, that's the human nature, that's the society nature, that's the nature of living together. In other words, you don't live in a society or in a group without having all those problems. Because each one of these, whether the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, is the realities that we have, each one of us psychologically, each one of us living in a society sociologically, we carry those qualities. That's a reality. However, what we told, of course, the systems, therefore, we have around us, they carry all those realities, volatile, uncertain, complex. We do not know what will happen tomorrow or 5 minutes later. However, the modernity told us that they will be controlling all. So they will be creating this perfect world, such as the perfect market economy. But then it doesn't happen because these are the realities. You cannot control everything in life. They are part of the process. We have to know how to manage those problems, okay? And therefore, in recent years, with the emergence of popularity of value coming into the process, what we have somehow this embedded notion of knowledge. This is disembedded from the value system, creating all these problems for us in front of us. And then we are told that we have to bring values to correct it, to moderate the consequences of this knowledge production mechanism. So therefore, adding value onto this embedded modern sciences, which resulted in all these problems, we are told that it will make our world much better in terms of it will make it more human, it will produce more better systems because values are important. But at the beginning of the knowledge creation, values are not considered as part of the process. In other words, what I'm trying to say that somehow values, we are told to bring it to correct the mechanisms, but we are not told that we have to construct the knowledge through the values from the beginning. Okay, so that creates the whole disembeddedness and two-layer system. So we continue to produce knowledge in the same way that we have to, considering that it's value-free, but because it fails, then we bring values to overcome that problem. And we are creating all these transactional problems, transactional costs in the process. So therefore, the eclectic nature has not been able to solve the problems. We have environmental problems a reality in the world, okay? And we are told that a number of strategies we can develop to respond to the environmental problem. Okay, but no one tells us that the entire production and consumption mechanism is wrong. Okay, so we are told that we have to continue with these production technologies, okay, modes of production, and then when we have these problems, then we have to find solution for those problems, but we are not allowed to look into this production technologies, what we call modes of production is wrong. So we continue to teach the same models, which creates the problem, but then later we come up with ideas how to solve the problems, but we are never allowed to go beyond that, saying that, look, this modes of production, the way we organize production in the societies, the way we organize consumption is wrong. So therefore, you have an eclectic understanding, and we are forced into this eclectic understanding. So you have these problems, and therefore, Catholics, the Islamics, and etc., each one of them comes together, bring the values, how we can solve this problem. But we are not allowed to reconstitute the knowledge which creates the problem. So that's dichotomy. Unfortunately, it's not helping us to find real solutions to the problems that we have. Each time, our role has become just the moderating the consequences of the processes. But the simple question, why we cannot change the processes, producing such outcomes in the entire system? So we cannot do that, because we were told that this is the end of history. The only way this is the way is knowledge is created and the processes are. And therefore, adding value, of course, is important for me as an individual, as a social theorist is important, but at the same time, I have to be critical to look into this increasing emphasis on the values. Okay, whether it is again an innocent process for me to enable to develop authentic solutions, or it is again instrumentalizing values, and that's important, instrumentalizing values to overcome the problems generated by other systems. So therefore, we have to go beyond this instrumentalization, whatever our values, whatever the religious, philosophical, non-religious values we have, rather than instrumentalizing those values, we have to look into how knowledge creation process can be reheld, look into how deconstructed, and therefore we can construct and look at and say that, look guys, we have these environmental problems, because the essence of the production process is wrong, okay? Because it's based on modernity. Modernity told us that the more you oppress the nature, you increase the efficiency, and with that, you increase the profitability, and that's the best solution, efficient solution. However, the problem is not in the efficiency, the problem is in the whole efficiency process. How, in reality, it should have been an equity-based model, so that all the stakeholders' right, including environment, human, but all the stakeholders' right could have been established from the beginning, rather than in the end we try to solve the problem. So the stakeholders' right had to be established in the production process from the beginning. And therefore the modern sciences, the assumptions that they told us that the knowledge is value-free, it's a value-free zones, and therefore whatever the outcomes we have is the social reality we have. No. Modernity has its own value, and that is the way it is imposed on the rest of us, okay, to solve the problems at the end of the day. And therefore, this denial that we don't have value is a total fallacy. Everything has a value. Modernity has a value. Whatever the textbook that we teach has a value system. And therefore, by excluding the other values, and they produce this, such as the environmental problem through the efficiency, by ignoring the importance of equity in the process. Perhaps, therefore, our values, looking at the problems we have in the end, our problems very much emanates from the way we constructed the knowledge, we borrowed that construction process, and the problems that we have in front of us today. And therefore, looking at this complexity, values are complex and has multi-layers, and we have to accept it. And therefore, looking at each one of these concepts and terms, what do they mean? Volatile, it tells us that likely to change suddenly, unexpectedly, by getting worse. But that tells us that having volatility, the entire assumption of the natural sciences, for instance, imposed by modernity, fails. Natural, under the normal conditions, there isn't any under the normal condition. The normal condition in reality is volatile. It's non-volatile. You do not have it. It's a reality. The individuals are volatile. We get angry suddenly. It happens. It's very normal. So the normal has been replaced by a default normal, which is entirely non-realistic. Okay? So therefore, the under the normal consumption assumption does not represent the reality because it suggests that there is no volatility in the system, for instance. Again, looking at uncertain. Again, when we look at the definition, not knowing what to do or believe or not able to decide about something, not known or fixed. In other words, there is no fixed reality. Okay? And that's the reality of life, because you cannot control everything. Not having the uncertainty implies that you are in charge, you are controlling everything. But even modernity could not do that. And therefore, in reality, there's nothing known for the world, human processes and systems that has been entirely controlled. So again, that's the nature of the world, despite the fact that modern science has told us that they are controlling. Again, they tell us that there is a perfect market economy. Then immediately after the second chapter of the book, we teach the reality. That's not perfect economy, is not the perfect market economy. Again, the complexity. The life is complex, the human nature is complex, the sociological living together is complex. However, we were told again that that complexity has been controlled, okay? And therefore, the promise of the modern science that everything that we have around us can be relegated to simple, to control, has not worked. And the reality is out there. The modern reality shows that nothing is simple. Again, just an anecdote, for instance, when the financial crisis, the global financial crisis happened a few years back, the Queen of England, she had a visit to the London Stock Exchange. It wasn't because of the financial crisis, it was pre-arranged visit, as the Queen does visit such institution from time to time. And she goes, and these guys, they are all mathematical, economic, finance genius. They do a presentation, amazing presentation, all these graphs, figures, models, and etc. running around. And when they finished the presentation, the Queen asked a simple question, okay? Those of you perhaps heard, she says that you have all this, and you couldn't guess that financial crisis is happening. So that's the reality, because the simplification of the complex universe, when you're simple and just a very natural question, because if you have all this, which implies that you are in charge, you are controlling everything, you are proudly saying that, look, we are in charge, we have all these models, figures, and everything is running. But no, it was financial crisis deepening at that particular moment in time. And therefore, it directly showed that this simplification of knowledge, okay, it doesn't help. So we have to look at the reality as a complex and how we can deal with that, rather than sweeping under the carpet. So the reality is out there is very much complex. Everything is complex in life. Our relationships, our family lives, and etc., everything is complex. And that complexity has to be acknowledged in order to, if I use the word again of modernity, in order to find efficient solutions. Because by ignoring those problems that we have around us, this complexity, we won't be able to solve the problem. So therefore, the world, by definition, is complex. And then ambiguous, of course, which means that having or expressing more than one possible meaning, sometimes intentionally. So in other words, we do not know what to mean. Whatever we read has different meanings to each one of them. But that's the reality, again, social reality. When we enjoy a novel, we get a particular lesson out of that, particular understanding of that, and X person has a different ways of looking at, Y person has a different, again, our values, the way we have been brought up, our backgrounds, and etc., it all plays an important role. And importantly, the way we have developed our faculties to look at social reality is important. When I look at, for instance, Less Miserables, that famous book, okay, when the guy comes out of prison, but he's still stealing stuff. When he goes to the church, his objective is to steal again something. When the priest tells the lady that put one table more on the table. So then I look at what could be the meaning of that. It could be because priest is generous and he wants to feed this guy, or it is something beyond that. What's the meaning of that statement in the Less Miserables? It is very much saying that we want to get this guy to be accepted by the society. Okay? Because it comes with a value system of generosity. A religious guy is a priest, so he wants to accept that person to the society rather than labeling him as a criminal, putting another plate on the table, the meaning of that. Okay? So therefore, looking at these words that we have around us, the statements that we have around us, they are not simple statements. Each one of them has a particular discourse, particular ways of looking at reality, therefore how we can look at that. And therefore the value-free nature of modern sciences are not there, because they promise that there is an unambiguous world out there. It is not. The world is ambiguous, and that's the reality. As in the mathematical sciences, it doesn't imply that everything in the same of mathematical sciences 2 times 2 is 4. Even for that statement 2 times 2 is 4, yeah, you can generate different values, because 4 has a different value in Kuala Lumpur, has a different value in a small village in Asia, in Africa, in Europe. The values attached to that 4 are entirely different. Okay? So again, it's the importance of looking at this ambiguity as an important way of looking at. Now, with all this, of course, happening, the leadership, how we have seen one way or another all these philosophical discourses centered around leaders, or with the facilitization of leaders, all the different ways of looking at reality has emerged. But beyond that also, in the modern times, in the times, or even in the postmodern times that we are today, the importance of leaders who can motivate people to make the changes and challenges and etc., to respond to the challenges that we have around us. And therefore, leadership has become an important discourse. But on the other hand, what leaders who can produce such outcomes? On the one hand, you have the VUCA world, where you have the volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, and etc. uncertainty, and that was produced by a particular leadership, particular thought leadership, particular political leadership. On the other hand, we are told now that there's a new way of looking at reality, that's the value-based understanding. That requires, of course, a different leadership, whether it is in education, politics, economics, society, and etc. And therefore, how that can be generated, how the new generation of leaders can come up and develop and motivate this change based on value-based understanding. Because it is complex. When we go into the value-based area, whose values are we talking? Okay, because each one of us define values in a particular way. Okay, so whose values we are going to bring into the equation? It brings us all these complexities, and therefore you need to have such leadership who can bring those values, whatever the values we define, we agree, and then can take up the challenges. In other words, the leadership we are talking now is no longer the charismatic leaders who tells us that I'm the best speaker, just follow me up. I will bring you to the future, transform individuals. So we are talking about the new paradigms. And therefore, looking at the ability, how the leaders can generate those abilities to influence individuals and societies and processes are important. And therefore, it is no longer a person as a leader emerges and the rest follows. No, it is reciprocal. Okay, the leaders are such people now who also grow out of the impact of the followers. So that relationship are important in whatever the organizations we are talking, whether educational institutions, universities, whether profit-making, non-profit-making institutions, leadership now is reciprocal. That's the only way. That's the value-based leadership. In other words, value-based leadership tells us that a leader who recognizes the values of the followers to motivate them, to take them to the next generation, next paradigm, next story. And that's the whole value-based leadership. Value-based leadership is not only bringing the value of that leader into the equation, bringing the values of the followers to the equation, and generating new practices and institutions through the values of those people that we call them followers. So therefore, the importance of the nuances that we have here, we have to be very careful again looking at, because leadership now is a people activity. It's not the charismatic way of looking at. It is not administrative. It is not, you guys follow me, I know the truth. No, we generate truths together. And that's the distinction that has to be understood, because there are different truths of regimes. And among all those truths of regimes that we have around us, the value-based leader is the one who understands the common practices of regime of truths in the society, in the organizations, and respond to them to carry to the future. And therefore, it is dynamic, and it involves the use of power, but not imposing power, establishing that negotiation. Through negotiation, how that can be happening. And therefore, when we look at as I mentioned in the beginning, when we talk about value-based leadership, bringing values to the equation, whatever we have, including leadership, including curriculum, including teaching, including production processes, systems, and institutions, we are saying that, look, the modern ways of looking at this reality is not working, and therefore we want to develop authentic ways of looking at reality. Whatever that authentic means, of course, from one person to another can be different. Because in the pre-modern world, it was the value system of each society led to the emergence of knowledge, institutions, and practices. What we call is embeddedness. In other words, the institutions, practices, knowledge were embedded in the social reality of each society. Therefore, you had all these different practices. And therefore, historically, you have different civilizations emerged in different parts of the world. But modernity later told us that, no, these differences are not good. There is one reality. That's the Eurocentric reality. But look at, modernity has not been able to create even one civilization. Okay? So that's important for us. There is not one civilization you can call Eurocentric civilization. The European civilization, again, pre-modern civilization. That's the reality of it. And therefore, looking at this embeddedness created by modernity, by establishing that gap between the base, the society, the values of the society, and the knowledge at the top, which doesn't represent the realities of that society. That's the disembeddedness we have, the gap between have. And therefore, base have become so disabled, cannot affect the superstructure, whether it is political, economic, sociological knowledge, whatever you have, this superstructure. So base in the rest of the world beyond Europe is stuck, that they cannot change the superstructure, which creates all those problems, okay? And because the knowledge that has been imposed in the rest of the world does not represent the values of the rest of the world at the base. So that creates what we call this embeddedness. In other words, the knowledge we teach in every part of the world is not necessarily the product of the social realities of those societies. And therefore, the whole whole idea that the Eurocentric knowledge is value-free is not. It represents a particular value world. And therefore, each society, therefore, by definition, has a particular right to define what knowledge is, how that knowledge is articulated, how that knowledge with the realities of that society can produce certain practices, institutions, and theories. In other words, there is no unique system as such. It just created all those problems that we have around us. And therefore, one way or another, by suggesting that value is important, and value leadership, therefore, is the solution to the problem, that is the recognition that knowledge has to be embedded in the social realities of each society so that the emerging leadership can respond to those problems. So what we are looking at, the journey between this initially it was an embedded society all over the world, created a disembeddedness because of the modernity, imposition of modernity. Now we are saying that we have to go back to that original embeddedness so that the values should determine the outcomes, processes, and etc. And that's an important recognition, in particular since 1970s, with the emergence of postmodernity, the idea that modern understanding has failed. And therefore, let's recognize the local. What local knowledge production processes can be possible, what they can tell us in terms of their unique system in each society, in each part of the world. And therefore, this embeddedness suggested by modernity, the realities have shown us that is not plausible. And therefore, we are going back, bringing all these different variables into the equation, including the values, to moderate the consequences of the problems created by modernity, whether it is in terms of knowledge, whether in terms of practices, whether in terms of theories, and etc. But again, our claim should be, we should not be instrumentalized to overcome the problems, but the values that we are talking from the beginning has to be part of the decision-making process, so that whatever the knowledge, theories, practices that we produce has to reflect those values from the beginning, rather than being instrumentalized to overcome the problems in the process. And that is the process that we have to look into. And therefore, looking at these modern imaginations versus the realities, of course, it tells us that the whole modernistic understanding of creating this universal truth has not worked, because each society has a particular regime of truth. So the universality didn't work. And therefore, this hierarchical development understanding of modernity, that this is the universal truth, and every society in the world will converge towards that universal truth, failed entirely. Although this is not recognized openly, but when you look at all these publications coming out in social theory, in particular anthropology and sociology, by definition tells us that it failed. And because each one of these papers published, whether empirical papers looking at different practices in different societies, tells us that there are different rationalities. It is not one single rationality that we have been imposed by modernity. There are different rationalities. And therefore, the whole idea of the positivist understanding and rationalism defined particular way is not necessarily the only way to look at the reality. And therefore, this whole monodirectional understanding of modernity and looking at the world in a particular way through certain assumptions is not necessarily the correct one. On the one hand, this modern understanding told us that defined human a particular way. Who is that human? Is a rational human. Who is that human? Self-maximizer human. Who is that human who aims at maximizing his or her utility? So the assumptions, the three assumptions. And then look at the societies in which you are living. All these three assumptions, are they held in reality? No. You have all these different ways of looking at. In other words, the definition of human, of course, is problematic, and the assumptions, and therefore it does not represent the particular assumptions of each society. And therefore, when we look at the departure from modernity, in particular since 1970s, the trust in modern knowledge in explaining the social reality has diminished further. Even the anecdote that I mentioned by the Queen on the explanatory power of this amazing system that they were putting forward and showing to the Queen, even that anecdote suggests that the whole idea of explaining social reality has not been successful. And therefore, against this very positivist, a particular way of defining human and the social reality and this scientific position and normative understanding, okay, has become an important way of looking at reality. In particular, anthropologists going to different parts of the world, looking at how those societies are organized. Okay, despite the modernistic knowledge, how they organized, how they survived, how they carried on, they have noticed that modernism is not the only way of organizing societies. In the jungles of Africa, you have an order, a particular order, it continues. So there are different orders, different ways of looking at reality, and therefore different value system, how it becomes important. Therefore, the universal laws, modernity suggested that there are universal laws that governs individuals and societies are not necessarily the universal truth that we have seen. And therefore, this satisfaction with the modern knowledge explaining the social reality, including physical sciences, has resulted in looking at the reality from different angles. And I use the words plural angles because each one of us has a particular way of looking at reality. The cultural repertoire of each society is different to look at reality. And therefore, the whole modes of production, how production processes, consumption processes can be organized, it can be different from what we have today, which creates all the problems that we have around us. I mean, looking at the basic, the old Indians, Red Indians, the original people of the American continent, they look at nature, they submitted to nature. So for them, becoming process was the way they submitted to nature, rather than oppressing nature. Okay? Then modernity came up, they said that the only way of survival to overcome all these problems that they mentioned, uncertainties, ambiguities, and etc., the more we control the environment and nature. The more we oppress the nature, the more we will control. But with that oppression, of course, the nature now is getting the revenge. Okay? But then, for instance, what could be the Confucian, what could be the Islamic, what could be the Jewish, and etc. other ways? Like I'm looking at from the Islamic perspective, for instance, that requires human to be in harmony with the environment as a value, not to be dominant, not to be submitting, but recognizing that as an essential stakeholder given by Allah as an amana, as a trust, and therefore how we can contribute to the development of environment as well, by definition of fitra, by definition of creation, as my own dependence, my own growth is a function of environment at the same time, a different value system. So a production process based on oppressing the nature, and then there are different cultural repertoires understanding what our relationship with nature, for instance. Okay? These are all different social realities that we can look at. And therefore, the postmodernity since 1970s, questioning the nature of knowledge created around us perhaps is not necessarily the way, and therefore we have to go back to each value system, try to understand all those value systems and how each society, each cultural repertoire can generate particular way of looking at reality. In other words, what postmodernists told us that there is no objective reality. Everything is subjective. Everything is value-oriented. And therefore, we talk about values, the importance of values today, even when we talk about sustainable development discourses. And therefore, what we see is a shift in epistemology. The way we theorize knowledge now has changed. No longer the value-free nature determines how we construct knowledge, but how values construct knowledge. So we shifted the paradigm now. We are in a different paradigm. And therefore, looking through that postmodernistic understanding, how we go beyond the modernity and we look at the articulation of knowledge, even in a primitive society, how they constituted the life. And therefore, what we can generate out of that. And therefore, what we see around us now, on the one hand, postmodernism helped us to bring the values back into the equation. On the other hand, of course, hegemonic political economy of the world doesn't allow us to change the superstructure, the nature of knowledge. Still, we teach the basics of the same modern teaching. So therefore, what it has become, so we accepted the modern as a base, and that we are not allowed to change, how we can bring additional layer with our value system as a filtering mechanisms that we can generate knowledge in relation to the cultural repertoire of our societies. Such as, for instance, Islamization of knowledge process is the recognition of that. Look, we cannot change the knowledge. It's a reality. It is imposed. It's a political economy. But what we can do, we can look at the consequences of knowledge, how we can Islamize to make it acceptable. So such attempts, partial attempts, have been generated in different parts of the world with different social movements, including environmentalist movement, okay? Environmentalist movement says that, look, the base, the production mechanisms and etc., which produces such outcomes, unfortunately, we cannot change. The companies will continue to be polluting the environment the way they are doing. They will continue to oppress the environment. But what we can do, we can get these companies to donate monies to overcome the problem. Okay, so just bringing the filters mechanisms to overcome. That's the way, unfortunately, the political economy works. The so-called democracies as well, unfortunately, do not allow you to question the basic fundamentals of how capitalist production mechanisms, for instance, work. You cannot suggest alternatives. And therefore, the political economy, unfortunately, has not changed. And therefore, in the end, what we have, multiple modernities. The base of the knowledge remains the same. How we can moderate the consequences of that knowledge has become through our values. And unfortunately, it is an instrumentalization of our values, but unfortunately, that's the way that is happening around us. And therefore, in the end, what you have with multiple modernities is an inclusive process. It brings different values from different societies, from different cultural repertoire to constitute new ways of looking at reality, okay? So it is borrowing, it is blending, it is cross-fertilization rather than the modernist understanding of excluding the others from the process. So it is one step of a development in the right direction, but still it doesn't allow us to go to the fundamental questions. And therefore, looking at from that perspective, the VUCA world, in other words, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is the realities that we have around us. And these realities, we were promised by modern knowledge, it will be controlled. But it's against the nature of societies, the nature of the nature itself to be able to control such realities. These are our realities. We have to work with these realities in the same sense the embedded societies of the pre-modern societies dealt with. So bringing our values, creating this embeddedness, how we can overcome this gap between the base and the superstructure, whether management, whether political, whether sociological, whether organizational, whether educational leadership, how they can overcome this gap now we have between us, so between the base and the superstructure, so that this value-based embeddedness can be generated at least in certain level. So that's the challenge now that we have in front of us, because these are the consequences of the modernistic understanding of conflict-based methodology, okay? Because your own maximizing your profit, your utility, it's based on how much you can oppress the workers, environment, and other resources in the society, the conflict-based methodology. We have to move on now, move away from this conflict-based methodology into a new paradigm in which all the interests of it, all those stakeholders can be put together in the same equation to produce a value-based understanding that we are talking. Therefore, the importance of stakeholders, theories, and etc. But again, we have to go to the base. The fundamental, how the values can go into the base to reshape the base so that the outcomes can get closer to the value system that we have around us. So that's the new leadership that we have to look into, how rather than just moderating the consequences of modernity that we have around us, how the processes and the systems can be redefined so that the outcomes can be acceptable rather than instrumentalizing the values in the process. And therefore, I'm stressing again the embeddedness as an important quality for leadership. Therefore, when we look at the leadership and the value-based leadership issues, it's important for us to understand the new leadership that we are looking for, whether in education, politics, society, economy, and etc., to be able to recognize the prevailing value system in each society and develop the necessary structures and knowledge in relation to that particular value system. In other words, rather than, like when you look at the Muslim societies as well as the developing societies, in the 20th century, you had charismatic leaders. They imposed their westernized values on the rest of the society, created this embeddedness between the base and the superstructure. Whether in knowledge, whether it is politics, whether it's sociology, that has been the tension in the last 100 years in developing countries, including in Muslim countries. And therefore, we have to overcome that gap. How the new leadership, rather than imposing their own values, that they think that the westernization was the only way, even now the West, the Eurocentric understanding tells us that no, there are different ways of overcoming the problems and organizing the societies. Therefore, how the new leadership can come up in the developing countries, including in the Muslim world, whether it is in every spheres of life, so that we can overcome this embeddedness, how the values prevailing in the base can be utilized to generate those qualities. Instead of, as the anecdote was mentioned, this small kid having that value system of being able to attach to the problems of other people, okay, rather than being very rational and self-maximizer, saying that whatever the collection I have, I'm going to buy video games. So that's the distinction. A rational individual on the one hand who wants to maximize his own or her own enjoyment. On the other hand, a kid who has this attachment to the humanistic objectives. And you can see that this embeddedness between the two. And therefore, how the new leadership can be generated to overcome, to respond to those issues by generating a new vision in which, rather than overlooking the society, how they can connect to the society, organization, whatever the particular institutions they are looking into. And therefore, that's an important, that visionary part, that passion is an important part of the new leadership that we are looking into value proposition. So rather than administrating, rather than imposing, engaging with the rest of the followers, how innovative manners can be developed, how imagination can be utilized by referring to the qualities of the society in which they are operating. And therefore, all these personal characteristics that leaders can bring into the table, looking at the social, personal, work-related intelligence, social background, physical characteristics that can recognize can develop as a leader, through which can create that impact that we are looking into. And therefore, leading change has become an important part of the story, how the leaders can make the necessary changes in the society. We were told that initially transactional leaders, that's the leadership that I have been telling you, an imposing leader, okay? Because he or she thinks that they have the knowledge, they have the practice, they know how to handle things. But of course, that even could not go into meeting the social needs of the subordinates, the society. And then the charismatic leaders emerged. Around one person who is supposed to know everything and can deal with everything, but that times have gone as well, because the charismatic leaders failed to understand the change. The change was in, as it has happened in the Eurocentric knowledge, going back to the base, looking at the value system of the base and what that value system tells us. And therefore, the transformational leadership has become an important quality. You are talking about leaders who can change the lives of individuals, the followers, the society, and etc. Not only what he does, but what qualities available in the followers and the society that can be translated into that leadership. Recognizing the needs and concerns rather than suggesting that there is only one way. And therefore, looking at new ways of organizing society, knowledge, and etc. And importantly, encourage them to question the status quo, the critical thinkers. The leaders, the value-based leaders have to be critical leaders so that they can reach out to ordinary people beyond the boxes. Because the modernist boxes that has been imposed on us, it doesn't allow us. So the new leaders, the value-based leaders should be able to reach out to the rest of the society, what knowledge base exists, so that what theories, practices, institutions can be developed, those knowledge bases available in the society. So the critical thinker, because the objective with the transformational leaders are emancipatory and empowering. Okay, so it is not managing people, it's not administering people, how we can emancipate individuals, and then how we can empower. What is the objective of education system should be, therefore, giving them the critical tools so that they become individual, not in the classical sense of individual as human who have the thinking power of relating to the rest of the world. Okay, so therefore the emancipatory and empowering nature of leaders who can empower their societies and emancipate their societies. Therefore, within the transformational understanding over the last 20-25 years, a different leadership understandings have been emerging. As opposed to one way of understanding and organizing management and governance as modernists told us. As opposed to that, with the emergence of postmodernity, therefore you see a number of different theories, ways of understanding. Why? Because the value-free understanding has been overcome. And therefore, we are going back to the individual roots, looking at each society, what practice is available there. Therefore, all this value-based leadership, ethical leadership, spiritual leadership, and etc. Do a Google search, you will come up with hundreds of papers coming up on these areas, looking and exploring that. It failed. And it's very interesting when the Americans were occupying Japan. Until that, the Fordist understanding of management and leadership was hegemony, the administrative system. But when they went to Japan, they looked at, well, these guys have entirely different ways of organizing society, organizing businesses and companies, and they are as efficient as Americans. So they realized that our way was not the only way. You see, because each society has a particular way of organizing. Therefore, all these leadership theories that is coming around us. But importantly, therefore, the value-based leadership aims at to overcome the resistance to change in the leadership positions, so that how the leaders can communicate, can engage, can recognize what is happening with followers, with society, with workers, and etc. And so that a good governance can be developed. And therefore, when we look at from the modernist perspective, it is terribly unnatural because it recognizes the differences in the society, the value system of the society. Therefore, what we are talking, whatever the sources of it, moral leaderships are emerging. Different moral leaderships are emerging. The time is an issue, so I will run. The moral leadership, when we talk about the value-based leadership, we are talking about moral leadership. And therefore, going back to the fundamental questions of wants and needs, aspirations and values, how leaders can relate to those questions and respond to that. And therefore, values-based leadership is a leader who can produce social change in relation to the value system of the society, the prevailing value system, and satisfy, therefore, the expectations of society. And therefore, the whole idea that in the value-based leadership is not the values of the leaders that to be imposed on the rest of the society. That was the charismatic leadership. We are talking about a democratic process that the leader understands the values of the base. Okay, and therefore it is entirely different, whether organization, whether country, whether society, whatever our unit of analysis, the leaders that we are talking who can understand rather than dominate the society, organization, whatever, but understand the particular value system, and therefore generates practices and theories and knowledge and system in relation to that in an authentic manner. Okay, and that's an important way of looking at the characteristics. Quite number of very commonly mentioned about characteristics of the value-based leaders, and like such as integrity, such as vision, trust, listening, respect for followers, clear thinking, inclusion, and etc. As you can see, in particular with inclusion, because you want to develop an inclusive governance as a leader, so that what the other says, if everyone agrees with a decision of the manager, that's not a good management, that's not good leadership. There's something wrong with that, there's an imposition. And such as Drucker, one of the contributors to management studies, apparently he used to say that, you know, if there is an agreement, the manager should create problem so that the disagreement can emerge. Because disagreement brings the debate, brings the best practice out of it. Rather than having everyone agreeing from the beginning, it suggests that there is a problem there, okay? And therefore, inclusiveness, then clear thinking, the criticality, and the vision are important qualities for us to look at. And therefore, looking at now such qualities of leadership, the values-based leadership, therefore, aims to overcome this embeddedness that I have been referring, connecting base with the superstructure, overcoming the gap. Therefore, the practices of the leaders have to be embedded in the value system of that particular society, whatever the knowledge and the practice that we can generate out of that. New practices, new knowledge, new ways of looking at the reality. And therefore, the problems that we stated in the beginning, it is this recognition of modernity of the reality. Now with the values-based leadership, the recognition of the complexity, the recognition that everything is difficult around us. Therefore, how we can, rather than simplifying things, how we can understand the complexity of systems, including individual, and how from the particular values of a particular society that we have, results and solutions can be produced. Each society has a particular knowledge base, and therefore, how we can develop that. But what is important, the base has a particular knowledge base. But the important issue and the question for us is whose knowledge base we are talking. Because the modernists can tell us that, look guys, you know, you are talking about all these different values, you are creating the problem for yourself you are not going to be able to solve. Okay, and that's the response they have. And therefore they say that, look, if we were to recognize all these different values, how we are going to run the market economy? Whose values will determine how we are going to establish the price if we are to accept the Islamic, Judaistic, Confucian, and etc., all those value systems, okay? It sounds a valid question, and it it immediately sounds that modernist way is the best way. No, it's not. Because they gave us the box, and they ask us to think within that box, and therefore when we get alternative suggestions, say that, look, this is your frame. No, we want to say that we want to go beyond those frames. Therefore, when we go beyond those boxes and the frames, we should be able to respond to those questions much easier. Then, because we can say that, look, we have all these historical practices before modernity. I don't know whether you are familiar with the Orientalist discourse. Edward Said, one of the leaders of the post-colonial thinkers, he said that in relation to the Muslim world is underdeveloped because they were not modernized. He told them that, look guys, if you haven't read it, I would suggest you to read Orientalism, Edward Said. He said, because you have these practices here, you have these institutions here, and then you use that as a benchmark, and then you use that benchmark to look at this society, and you say that, look, this society doesn't have these institutions, and doesn't have these practices, therefore it is underdeveloped. Who says that? That is your box. That is your understanding. This society is flourished, but they are undermined because of your impositions. Okay? The boxes impose on us, and therefore we have to go beyond those boxes and look at, and my time, of course, is an issue. And therefore, articulating value-based relationship, what do we mean by that? Because that refers to a particular ontological understanding, how we understand knowledge. The basic question, for instance, asking the question, whatever we have around us, do you think it is a right or it's a privilege? Anyone? Is it a right or privilege? Anyone? It is privilege? Anyone? It says right? No. Okay? That's very interesting, because then the problem that refers to a particular ontology, but each one of you, each one of us, including me, we are teaching a knowledge which considers everything that we have around us is a right. Because all the knowledge that we teach, it assumes everything that we have around us is a right. It is your right. But each one of us here in this hall thinks that it is privilege. I think it's a privilege as well, entirely. You see that this embeddedness that I am referring to, we believe in something, and that is our value. It is privilege, whatever we have around us. But when we lead, when we go to class, when we lead, when we become a political party leader, when we become an organization, then we think that everything is right. Okay? You see the inconsistency, unfortunately, imposed on us. This is the box that I was referring to. Yes, indeed it is privilege, and I believe that it is privilege, and I promote that it is privilege. Because when you say it is right, you define human in a particular way. When you say that it is privilege, you define human in a particular way. You locate human in a different way to the reality that we have around us. And that's the important difference when we talk about the value-based leaders. And therefore, how our value-based leaders can recognize, okay, that everything that we have around us is privilege, and therefore the knowledge, practices, and systems can be constructed around that rather than believing in that, but practicing something else. So that's the tension that we have to look into that. Because when you say it is right, okay, you are attached to Eurocentric and modernistic ontology, okay? And therefore it tells us that all these VUCA problems that we have. But if your answer is privilege, then of course you are attached to a particular spiritual, particular ontological understanding. Like in Islam, everything is bestowed on us as a privilege, and we are not in charge. We are just the usufruct, we are just the users, and we pass on. You can ask the question, what do you mean we don't have the property rights and etc.? Yes, but they are only contractual rights to give you the right to use it. You do not own it in reality, because you cannot take anything to the hereafter. Okay, everything is owned by Allah, for instance, in the Islamic ontology, okay? So you define human in a particular way. If it is right, then it is your right to self-maximize. Whatever happens to others, it is your right to maximize your own, because you are a rational individual, okay? You are egocentric individual, so the way you define it. However, then it comes to privilege, then you are no longer a maximizer. Like that boy, you have to give in order to get this falah, the salvation, the happiness, okay? So you talk about a different individual now. It's not a self-maximizing individual, an individual who maximizes only through giving, through expanding, through giving. So a different individual. So your assumptions about human change, about social reality change, entirely you move into a particular understanding, okay? And therefore the interesting part of the, just they are pressurizing with time, I'll finish that. But what we are saying, therefore, the practices, knowledge institutions, they have a particular ontological source, the value, okay? That leads to a particular values, norms, and cognitive realities. That results in what we call is the organic emergence. In other words, you develop knowledge, practices, and institutions based on the value system of your society, rather than imposed on you. There is nothing wrong with the cross-fertilization. The civilizations emerge with civilizations borrowing and blending, but not dominance, imposition, as the modernity has done it. And therefore, organic emergence. And that results in a particular theory, practice, and the way we understand. So what we are saying that everything starts with an order. You understand there is an order, privilege-based order. Everything is given as an order, such as in the case of Islamic. Unfortunately, we do not have time to go into different ontologies, but in the Islamic ontology, therefore, it's a particular ontological understanding, Tawheed. Tawheed suggests the complementarity and unitarity in the sense that everything complements each other. No one's interest can be dominant over the other. Okay, so you are talking about entirely different ways of understanding what knowledge is. It's not the knowledge of dominance, but establishing that equality between all the stakeholders in the process. Because the objective is emancipate and empower individuals. And that leads to a particular worldview. You can do the same replications with other ontologies, okay? And that leads to a particular worldview. In other words, how we see universe, how we locate human in the universe, what are our assumptions about human. So Islam sees that life as a privilege, and therefore individual falah, the salvation, as the objective function, okay? And ihsan is a particular individual who engages, who gives, he get concerned with what happens in life. Then that leads to a particular social formation, how society is organized, okay? How we organize society. Islam has particular take-up. Modernity has particular take-up. In other words, embeddedness, whatever the practices, theories, knowledge we generate has to be embedded within that knowledge base. As you mentioned, it's a privilege. So whatever the practice we develop has to reflect, whatever the knowledge we have has to reflect that knowledge base. It has to be embedded in the value system of Islam. And that generates the system, whether social system, political system, economic system, and etc. So that's the organic emergence that we are talking. And therefore, what is expected, the leadership, the values-based leadership, to be able to relate, rather than imposing what he or she thinks, but reflecting through that organic emergence, what institutions and practices the societies can produce in responding to the particular problems that they are having, such as my take-up on the Islamic leadership, how they can contribute to organic emergence, as we talk. In other words, how, based on the organic, because nowadays everything has to be organic, so the organic emergence, how organic, based on the value system of the base of the society, what kind of emergence can happen. So what you are talking is the Islamic ontology through Tawheed determines the value system. That value system results in defining the norms, because value is the moral system. The norms are particular ways of looking at reality. Accepting the cognitive repertoire, what exists in the society, how that fits into through the sequencing process. Then defining the roles, then the importance of leaders, because through that process you are defining what roles each individual, including the leader, has in the society. According to that value system, you are defining who is capital owner, who is labor, who is leader, who is scientist, and etc. You are defining all these qualities, all these roles, okay? And then that results in particular understanding of what theories and institutions can emerge in a particular society. And therefore, the importance of Tazkiyah process, in other words, we are all connected. And therefore, our growth with all the stakeholders has to be in line, it has to be in harmony. So a different paradigm, rather than controlling all the stakeholders, accepting that they are in equal footing. Why? Because you believe that Allah created everything with a particular path to development, particular path to develop, the fitra process, okay? How we can develop. And that's an important process for us. And within that, therefore, the leadership, recognizing that every stakeholder in the society has a particular path to perfection and development. Everything, therefore, everyone's interest has to be counted in the equation. And because the complementarity, if you run one factor becoming dominant against the other, that's not acceptable, because that runs against the complementarity equation. And therefore, the leadership that we are looking for, how they can produce such qualities, and therefore how they can contribute to emancipation and empowering individuals. And that is something that we have to look into, how the vision can be developed and communicated so that the empowerment and emancipation can be constituted. In other words, recognizing those qualities, embedded knowledge has to be created with a human focus, but not forgetting the interests of others, and then challenging the status quo, the critical thinkers, and establishing necessary institutions, the emerging institutions, the organic institutions in its society, and ensuring that that's a sustainable society with a particular and new understanding. Because our objective to get the value-based leaders to contribute to that process of emancipated and empowered individuals. That's the promise. Every individual is created as emancipated, and that process has to be concluded, as opposed to modernist understanding of domination. I think that is my take-up with the values-based leadership. I know I have gone through a lot and I rushed in certain parts, but in the simple sense, value-based leadership is an important take-up now, how leaders can be embedded into social realities of the societies in which, or the organization in which they are operating, by recognizing that, and importantly by recognizing that, how they can therefore refer, practicing, developing, innovating, communicating new knowledge, new practices, new system in line with the value system of that society in which they are operating. And hopefully with that, we'll aim at to reach to that sustainable societies, not in terms of only sustainable development goals, but sustained societies in an embedded manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehmet, for the philosophical and practices point of view of our VUCA world. We have a number of questions in our Slido, but let's just pick one. And I believe, Professor, you only have 5 minutes to answer this question.
Yep.
What would be a sustainable approach in transforming the future generations to be ready for a hyper-competitive VUCA world when the current world is so used to a transactional leadership style?
Okay, I think there are quite a lot of issues in that question. If you want to deconstruct, it will take a lot of time. Yes, emerging transformation leadership are objective. But of course, the question, there was something in that follow, so I so used to, I see, okay. So there was a concept in the question, competitive and etc. Yes, I think this is an important question. In other words, we have an adaptive learning, okay? Someone knows, and therefore we have to follow. It's a very transactional leadership understanding, because that is an extension of the charismatic leadership. But as I mentioned, that has not produced outcomes, because that was the old leadership, because it assumed that the leaders know everything. But that was the modernist understanding, because modernist understanding relegated complexity into simplicity. So the leaders cannot know everything. That's not possible. And importantly, of course, with the transactional leader, the whole objective is to impose the thinking of the leader to the rest of society. That doesn't work. It didn't work. And therefore, we are now in the transactional societies, transformational societies, transformational leaders, value-based leaders. Now, an important part of that is the unpacking whatever the practices and knowledge we have around us, okay? Therefore, the educational institutions that we have to look into how these critical thinkers can be developed to overcome this imposed reality, so that we can bring up this social reality in relation to whatever the value we have. In other words, the box that we have around us, it was a product of transactional leaders. Now, with the transformational leaders, they have to open up the channels, okay, so that the critical thinking can be developed regardless of whatever we are studying, whether physics, mathematics, or economics, sociology, whatever. Because this knowledge basis comes with certain assumptions. And we have to produce the new generation which can unpack the knowledge and then reconstitute the knowledge in a particular way that is in the interest of the society, in the value system of the society in which it is. And therefore, the challenge for us, for those of people in the developing countries who have been assumed into transactional leaders, we have to challenge that by creating this discourse-based understanding. How our teaching in the universities in particular should be research-based teaching rather than textbooks teaching, okay? Because textbook teaching comes with a packed knowledge, and that packed knowledge is a product of a particular value system. And therefore we have to show, I'm not saying teach, we have to show our students how they can unpack knowledge by developing critical thinking, okay? And therefore they can see how knowledge was constituted, to be able to see that there's a particular value system there. And therefore that would enable individual students to become skeptical about the existing knowledge and move into the new spheres of knowledge development. Every student would not be able to reach to that, perhaps, which is true. But in every class, if we can get 10 students to be able to reach to that critical thinking level, we should be able to overcome this transactional leadership nature. Because one of the qualities of the transformation leader is to be inclusive, to be engaging with rather than imposing. And therefore, if we have the real transformation leaders, they should be able to open up this channel of critical thinkers, okay? So that they should be able to question that perhaps 2 times 2 is not 4. I know it's a radical take-up, but perhaps it's not, because the values and etc. Perhaps all these assumptions that we have around us, as I was trying to go through, perhaps is not true. Therefore, my take-up on that question is the critical thinking. An education system, we are here in this institution for higher education. My only appeal is the critical thinking has to be part of the curricula to be able to respond to the knowledge development. And knowledge development that is authentic, that is related to the realities of this society. And that will hopefully break the imposed transactional leadership and open up new channels for us.
Thank you very much for your response, Professor Mehmet. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it again for Professor Mehmet for his speech on value-based leadership in a VUCA world.
Thank you very much.